Bonjour, bon dia. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to talk with you. And this morning, what I propose to do is walk fairly quickly through our policy, providing an overview, and then opening up for your questions and comments, because I think that will make for the richest discussion. My boss, Assistant Secretary Linda Thomas Greenfield, who is in East Africa today, is with Secretary Kerry in that picture, and we'll go to the next slide, please. So in June of 2012, President Obama issued a policy statement guiding our Africa policy, and that policy has four main components, and I'll drill down into each of them. But starting with the promotion of democracy, human rights, and good governance, then promoting economic growth, trade and investment, peace and security, and last but not least, development. Next slide, please. And underlying all those objectives is a determination to work with women and disadvantaged groups, to make certain that we are working with young people, and I'll say much more about that, working on the unique needs of conflict and post-conflict states, and last but not least, working very closely with the United Nations, other international organizations, and other bilateral partners, because the United States cannot do everything alone, and we recognize that. Next slide, please. Let's talk for a minute about democracy. This is the map that Freedom House produces each year of freedom in the world. And in Southern and East Africa and in West Africa, we see a lot of countries getting relatively high marks. In Central and East Africa, not so much. And this map will change, no doubt, in the coming years, and it is a constant work in progress. But when President Obama was in Kenya and Ethiopia almost 2 weeks ago now, he reiterated the point that he's made throughout his administration, that we believe in promoting strong institutions and not strong men, that term limits, in his view, are a great way to promote change, not necessarily change from one party to another, but to get people with new ideas into government. And he pointed out, and I suspect correctly, that were he to run for a third term, he would be very competitive. So this is not about how long you can stay in office. It's about getting things done and bringing in new ideas. And it's with that in mind that we approach the subject of term limits. And as all of you are aware, our opposition to term limits in Burundi and the Burundian people's opposition to, not opposition to term limits, our support for term limits, and the Burundian people's support for the Arusha Accords that imposed a two-term limit have brought about the current crisis in Burundi. Next slide, please. When we talk about economic growth, let's be very clear that per capita income in sub-Saharan Africa is at its highest level ever, at around $650. Now, there are still a lot of people living on less than $2 a day, but the trajectory is a positive one. And we believe that by promoting trade and investment, we can contribute to that economic growth. Next slide, please. However, there's a key to economic growth that we all need to focus on. And that is, much of Africa's growth to date has been driven by the development of raw materials and by agricultural exports. In order for Africa to leap to the next level, there has to be more value added. There has to be more industrialization. You have to have more technology, more factories. When the president was in Kenya, he opened the Global Entrepreneurship Summit. And during that two-day event, which was the sixth of these summits, but the first in sub-Saharan Africa, he really highlighted the importance of entrepreneurship, of people taking their own creative and innovative ideas and applying those to their environment to create jobs for themselves and for others. And we believe that this is so important for Africa's growth that we have programs not only for young entrepreneurs, but also for women entrepreneurs. Yesterday, we hosted 30 women entrepreneurs at the State Department from all over Africa. And at the end of this month, we'll be having the 15th African Growth and Opportunity Act Forum in Libreville, Gabon. And this will be another opportunity to talk about how trade and investment can contribute to growth. Next slide, please. So, another thing that I spend a lot of my time on are the countries in conflict. And conflict here is defined very broadly, but if you look at Southern and Eastern Africa once again, it's relatively conflict-free. We would like to see that same color map across the continent. And when we look at the Sahel and go all the way to the Red Sea, that's the area that I, as the number 2 person in the Bureau of African Affairs, spend the bulk of my time on. Mali, Central African Republic, the whole region that's affected by Boko Haram, and it's not just Nigeria, it's Nigeria and its neighbors. And then South Sudan. Sudan has largely fallen off the front pages of the papers, but in fact, Darfur continues to be a very deadly place with millions of people displaced and thousands of people being killed each year. And we have not forgotten about it at the State Department. And South Sudan is very much a man-made crisis. President met with regional leaders when he was in Addis Ababa to emphasize the importance he has placed on bringing about a peace agreement, and we have set a deadline of August 17th, which is rapidly upon us, for a deal brokered by the Intergovernmental Authority for Development, but backed by a number of partners. And certainly while my boss is in East Africa, she will be talking about how to bring peace to South Sudan. The humanitarian crisis there is a man-made crisis. Let there be no mistake about it. And we can debate its roots and how it started, but the important thing is how we stop it. Let me, at this point, say a bit more about how we're approaching conflicts, because while we do it through mediation, there are a number of other steps that we're taking. In Somalia, we have long supported the AMISOM, the African Union organized peacekeeping effort, and we've made tremendous progress. Somalia is in a much better place than it was 5 years ago. Indeed, it is so much further along that we have decided to name the first U.S. ambassador to Somalia since the early 1990s. AMISOM has made real progress in recapturing territory that had been occupied by al-Shabaab. The Kenyans and the Ethiopians in particular, along with the Ugandans, have captured significant amount of territory in the latest offensive. And the challenge now is building the capacity of the Somali government and the Somali National Army to maintain those gains. We are also supporting peacekeeping operations in other places, and we have very much appreciated our partnership with the African Union and the United Nations to do this. Obviously, there are major peacekeeping operations in DRC, in Mali, in Central African Republic, in South Sudan. However, We still have peacekeeping operations in Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire, which will be winding up in the very near future. And we are constantly looking at how to fund those peacekeeping operations. Nearly all of the major peacekeeping operations around the world are in sub-Saharan Africa. And we have been striving to assure financing for those operations in a predictable way. And we're continuing to look at ways to have that continuity. In addition, last year at the Africa Leaders Summit, President Obama proposed a new peacekeeping initiative, the African Rapid Response Program, or APREP as it's called. And APREP is designed to enhance the capacity of 6 African countries to do peacekeeping by providing them with transport and specialized training so that they can be more of a rapid reaction force. The African Union for a long time has worked to have a standby force. We want to push that effort forward, and we believe that APREP is a vehicle for doing so. And this year and the next 3 to 5 years, we will be investing $110 million a year in this effort. This is above and beyond the African Contingency Operations Training Assistance Program, ACOTA, where we've been doing peacekeeping training for many years, since the mid-1990s, and where we continue a very robust program of peacekeeping training in many countries. Next slide, please. I mentioned 2 initiatives that the President's very focused on, but let me talk about a few others that I think are critical elements of our policy. One is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR. This started under President Bush, but it is the most successful assistance program since the Marshall Plan. And it has saved millions of lives, ensured that millions of people are receiving antiretroviral drugs to prevent the transmission of HIV and to keep those people productive and relatively healthy. It has also ensured that mother-to-child transmission of HIV has been reduced. Secondly, the President's Malaria Initiative, or PMI, has made a huge difference. In the countries where we have malaria initiatives, we have seen indoor spraying and use of bed nets bring the prevalence of malaria way down. In Rwanda, for example, we've brought childhood cases of malaria down by 46% since the program started. It's a remarkable statistic when you think about it. In addition, President Bush also launched the Millennium Challenge account. To date, we've signed $8 billion worth of compacts. Well over half of those are in sub-Saharan Africa. And increasingly, we're focusing on infrastructure and energy. I'm often asked, why is the United States not more involved in infrastructure with our aid programs? But in fact, Millennium Challenge account, to a great degree, is about infrastructure. Building roads in Senegal, addressing Ghana and Malawi's energy needs, and also enhancing agriculture to reduce poverty. Next slide, please. Some of the initiatives that President Obama has launched and that are having an impact include the Young African Leaders Initiative. Monday through Wednesday of this week, we had the Young African Leaders, 500 Washington Mandela Fellows here in Washington. They met with the president, they met with my boss and a variety of other people. When I went to reception at the Omni Shoreham Sunday night, the energy level and the noise coming from the enthusiastic young people who were there was amazing. It was just extraordinary. And that energy level is why we're bringing these 500 young people together. We believe that, as the president emphasized in the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit last year, that this is an investment in the next generation, that bringing 500 people a year who are very dynamic, giving them some specialized training so that they have better tools to work in their own countries, your own countries, and next year bringing 1,000 per year, as well as establishing leadership academies across the continent in Senegal, in Ghana, in Kenya, and in South Africa, so that the training programs can continue on a regular basis and be available to people who are not able to participate in the Washington Fellowship, is a great investment in Africa. In addition, the President has committed the United States to working with private sector and other partners to create 16 million new electric connections. All of you know that electricity is limited in many of your countries. We have load shedding, we don't have connections. 60 million new connections will be tremendous, and that represents an addition of 30,000 megawatts. Let's consider the fact that Liberia currently produces 25 megawatts. If you add 3,000 megawatts across the continent, that's huge. Kenya at present only produces about 2,000 megawatts. We're talking about 30,000 new megawatts of electricity. A lot of that will be from hydropower, and that does not count off-grid connections and renewables in places where the grid does not make sense. Trade Africa originally started with the East African community and expanded now to 6 other African countries, mostly in West Africa. The idea is to promote intra-regional trade and to promote exports. This works in tandem with the African Growth and Opportunity Act, and in countries like Kenya, we're seeing a real impact with growth driven by exports, particularly of textiles. Madagascar, Lesotho, Swaziland were other examples of that export-driven growth. And Swaziland was suspended last year because it was not implementing labor rights that are required under the AGOA legislation. Madagascar was suspended for a time but was readmitted. We believe that the policy framework that goes with AGOA encourages continuous progress. That's the idea. And we're constantly reviewing that progress. Because of our trade disputes with South Africa and South Africa's limits on U.S. exports of beef, poultry, and pork, we will be doing a special review of South Africa under the AGOA legislation, the new legislation, and that will be taking place over the next 3 or 4 months and will be a hot topic of discussion later this month in Libreville. Last but not least, I do want to mention Feed the Future. Major investment in agriculture in many of your countries. It's an effort to revolutionize agriculture in 2 ways. One, to increase productivity, but also to have people produce more cash crops in addition to staples so that they have more income. And I visited one of these projects in Malawi when I was there recently, and in this particular project, we were only working with women farmers. They'd been growing nothing but maize essentially for years, and some tobacco, but now they've branched out into other crops that are very saleable, and they're seeing their personal incomes go up, and that means more money for their communities, more money to buy things for their children. It's proved to be a very good investment. Next slide, please. So, last year at the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, the theme was Investing in the Next Generation. But when we look at the topics that were actually discussed in the different sessions, we had one entire day devoted to business. And $33 billion were in deals for both trade and investment were announced at that gathering. And what really distinguished the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit from the summits that China and Japan and France and the European Union and others hold was the emphasis on trade and investment. And that doesn't mean that we didn't discuss the other key issues: development, peace and security, democracy, good governance, and human rights. And those themes were featured prominently in all of the president's discussions when he's been on each of his 4 trips to Africa, including the most recent one. And he is anxious to see progress in all 4 of these areas. Let me stop there and hear from you so that we can have a dialogue. Thank you for your attention.